There was a time when money did not need permission, when a transaction ended the moment it happened. You handed something over, you received something in return, and it was finished. No confirmation screens, no pending status, no third party watching the exchange. Money was final. Cash did not ask who you were. It did not ask where the money came from. It did not ask what the payment was for. It worked the same everywhere, in cities and villages, in rich countries and poor ones, across borders, languages, and systems. If you had it, you could use it. If you paid, the transaction was complete. That finality mattered. It meant no one could reverse the exchange. No one could freeze it. No one could delay it. Trust lived in the moment of exchange, not in an institution behind it. Cash carried no memory. It did not log behavior. It did not store history. It did not report patterns. Once the transaction ended, it disappeared. This made cash simple. But simplicity does not mean weakness. It meant clarity. You knew where you stood. You knew what you had. You knew when something was finished. Money did not follow you after the exchange. It did not linger. It did not notify. It did not remind. It moved on. Cash shaped behavior quietly. People planned with what they could hold. They saved physically. They spent deliberately. Limits were visible. You could see what you had left. You could feel when it was gone. There was no abstraction, no credit illusion, no delayed consequence. What you spent, you no longer had. This was not perfect, but it was understandable. And because it was understandable, it became universal. Cash was not just money. It was an agreement, a shared understanding that value could be exchanged. Without permission, without delay, and without record. That understanding shaped the world for centuries. And then, without ceremony, the center of gravity shifted. Cash. The change did not arrive all at once. Cash did not vanish overnight. People did not stop using it suddenly. What changed was not the form of money, but its behavior. Money began to remember. Transactions stopped ending when the exchange finished. They continued elsewhere. In systems, in ledgers, in databases. A purchase was no longer just an exchange between two people. It became an entry. A record tied to time, location, and identity. At first, this felt like progress. Mistakes could be corrected, fraud could be reversed, lost funds could be traced, money became safer in certain ways. But safety came with structure. Banks stood between buyer and seller. Networks verified transactions. Institutions approved access. Trust moved outward. It no longer lived only in the moment of exchange. It lived in systems that watched, recorded, and resolved disputes. Finality softened. Payments could be pending. Transactions could be reversed. Funds could be held. Money gained memory. And memory changed behavior. People spent differently when payment was delayed. They borrowed against the future. They separated action from consequence. The moment of exchange lost its weight. What you paid was no longer always what you lost. What you received was no longer always final. This made money flexible. But flexibility came with dependence. To spend, you needed access. To access, you needed approval. To resolve issues, you needed time. The exchange was no longer self-contained. It extended outward, into institutions you could not see. Money began to follow you, not physically, but informationally. Patterns formed, histories accumulated, profiles emerged. Spending stopped being anonymous by default. It became contextual. Your money now existed within systems that could observe it, evaluate it, and intervene. This did not feel like control. It felt like convenience, because the systems worked most of the time. But the shift had already occurred. Money no longer simply moved. It reported, it remembered. And once money remembers, the balance of power changes. When money began to remember, power began to move. Not suddenly, not visibly, but decisively. Finality had once placed power at the point of exchange. Whoever held the cash controlled the moment. Once the transaction ended, no one else could intervene. But when money became managed, that control dispersed. Authority shifted outward, into institutions that verified, approved, and resolved. To spend, you needed access. To access, you needed compliance. To resolve disputes, you needed time. The moment of exchange was no longer sovereign. It was conditional. This changed who decided outcomes. A transaction could be delayed. A payment could be questioned. Funds could be frozen, not arbitrarily, but structurally. The system did not need to be malicious. It only needed rules. And rules, once embedded, do not require intent to exert power. They operate automatically. Power no longer lived only with the individual. It lived in policies, in thresholds, in automated decisions. This made money more orderly, but it also made it less personal. The relationship between buyer and seller was no longer complete on its own. It depended on external validation. If the system approved, the exchange stood. If it did not, the exchange unraveled. Finality became provisional, and provisional systems always retain authority. This altered behavior. People began to think in terms of access rather than possession. What mattered was not only what you had, but whether you could use it. Balances existed, but availability depended on status. Money became something you could hold, and still be unable to spend. This was not oppression. It was re-architecture, a quiet relocation of control from hands to frameworks, from momentary exchange to ongoing permission. The power once carried in physical money had moved elsewhere, and once power moves into systems, it rarely announces itself. It simply becomes normal. Once money stopped ending in the moment, people began to think differently about it. Spending no longer felt final. A purchase could be reversed. A payment could be delayed. A mistake could be corrected. This softened consequence. People became more willing to spend money they did not yet have. Credit bridged the gap. The future entered the transaction. Saving also changed. When money existed primarily as numbers on a screen, it became easier to abstract. You could see your balance without feeling its limits. The physical feedback disappeared. There was no empty wallet, no tangible sense of gaunt, only figures that could rise and fall. This changed planning. Budgets became projections. Debt became normal. Waiting became optional. Money was no longer something you held. It was something you managed. This encouraged flexibility. But flexibility required constant attention. Balances needed monitoring. Accounts needed maintenance. Access needed protection. Responsibility increased. Not because people became careless, but because the system demanded more engagement. Money followed you into more moments of life. Spending could happen anywhere, at any time, with a tap or a swipe. The boundary between decision and action narrowed. Impulse shortened the distance. This did not make people irrational. It made them responsive. The system rewarded speed. Delayed decisions felt like friction. Instant payment became convenience. And convenience reshaped habits. Over time, people adapted to this rhythm. They trusted systems to catch errors. They relied on alerts to warn them. They expected reversibility. Finality stopped being the norm. This reduced anxiety in some ways. But it also extended responsibility forward. Consequences did not disappear. They moved from the moment of exchange to a longer chain of monitoring, adjustments, and follow-ups. Money became something you never quite finished dealing with. It stayed open, like a tab that never fully closed. Over time, the system stopped being noticeable. Not because it loosened, but because people adjusted their expectations. Managed money became normal. People stopped thinking about reversibility. They stopped noticing delay. They stopped questioning access. The rules faded into the background. What mattered was whether things worked. Balances updated. Payments cleared. Accounts synced. As long as the system responded, it felt reliable. Trust shifted, not toward the person across from you, but toward the system in between. People learned its rhythms. They waited for confirmations. They checked timestamps. They refreshed screens. Money was no longer something you exchanged. It was something you interacted with. Daily life reorganized around this interaction. Bills arrived digitally. Salaries appeared automatically. Subscriptions renewed without notice. Money moved even when you weren't watching, and because it moved quietly, it felt effortless. This reduced friction, but it also reduced awareness. Spending blended into routine. Payments lost their edges. Costs became ambient. The moment of exchange faded. In its place was continuity. Money became part of the background of life, like electricity or water, always present, mostly invisible, only noticed when it failed. People stopped asking what money was. They focused on what it allowed. Access mattered more than possession. Connectivity mattered more than cash. This was not imposed. It was convenient, and convenience is persuasive. Once a system becomes convenient enough, questioning it feels unnecessary, even disruptive. The system didn't need to justify itself. It simply became the default. Money no longer marked moments, it flowed. And when something flows continuously, it stops being felt. It becomes assumed. Cash did not protect wealth. It protected certainty. When a transaction ended, it ended completely. There was no follow-up, no adjustment, no lingering responsibility. The moment closed. This gave people clarity. You knew what you had done. You knew what you owed. You knew where you stood. Money did not trail behind you. It did not require monitoring. It did not wait for confirmation. It did not ask for continued attention. Cash gave exchanges an edge, a clear before, a clear after. That edge mattered. It allowed people to move on, to finish one decision before entering the next. When money lost finality, that edge softened. Transactions stayed open. Balances remained provisional. Consequences stretched forward. Money became something you were always managing, never fully completing. This did not remove responsibility. It redistributed it. From moments to systems. From certainty to oversight. From closure to continuity. Cash once made limits visible. You could see them, feel them, respect them. Today, limits exist, but they are abstract. They live in rules, thresholds, and alerts. They are enforced quietly. After the fact, cash was not perfect. But it made one thing simple. When something was paid for, it was done. That simplicity shaped behavior. It gave people psychological rest, the freedom of knowing that nothing remained unfinished. The shift away from cash did not remove value. It changed where value lived, from objects to systems, from hands to frameworks. This is not a loss that can be reversed, but it is one that can be understood, because understanding what finality gave us helps explain why modern money often feels heavier, even when it is more convenient. What cash protected was not anonymity alone, it was closure. And closure, once lost, is difficult to rebuild.